Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Mimi interim meeting. We're going to be focused back on discovery today. It's just me today. Alyssa can't join us, so I think I guess let's just get right on into it. So as usual, please note well. Make yourself aware, if you aren't already, of the IETF's Code of Conduct and intellectual property policies. We don't have a ton of attendees today, so I think I'll just go ahead and take notes, since I think everyone who is on the call is going to be more busy actually participating in the discussions. So the agenda for today, since like I was saying before, we're focused back on discovery today. We didn't get any other agenda items submitted to the chairs by email or anywhere else. So once we're done with the administrative I'm currently working through, John, who is guest on the call, is going to resume leading us through the discovery requirements discussion that we've been having for the last handful of interims. Do we have any agenda bashes? Any other agenda items to add before we move on? Okay, doesn't sound like. So in that case, John, if you're ready, your slides are loaded in. I can hand control over to you, or I'm happy to drive it for you.
Why don't you drive, if that's okay?
Sure.
That way I can stay laser focused on the exciting discussion we're having here. I think I just heard a bantha in the background somewhere. So yes, I'm John Peterson, and we're going to be talking a bit more about Mimi discovery. The good news is, after our 2-hour session in Brisbane, the 2-hour session in the previous interim, I only really had 2 slides left of stuff that we needed to cover to try to get through what I was hoping we would get through in Brisbane. And so, I hope this is not going to take the entire 2 hours today, but to start off, why don't we go to the next slide? I did try to take all of the consensus points that we had kind of captured across this and consolidated into just 2 slides that, are a bit of a last minute sanity check. So, as we will get to, and I don't want to give away the ending of this fascinating presentation before it begins, this is all leading up, of course, to us issuing a proper requirements draft that will be available in advance of Vancouver. And, these next couple slides are just going to cover what I think we've agreed on. There may be a few still questions that will appear in these, but this at least will establish a baseline. But I would ask if anybody here, as I go through these things, thinks they're particularly unclear or thinks we do not in fact have consensus about this would be a good time to speak up, because this at least is what will probably be significant input into the requirements draft for Vancouver. All right, so what are the basics? So we have this concept of a discovery provider. I think the intuition of the group seems to be that for the most part, discovery providers are going to be operated by message service providers. And the thinking is here, of course, that message service providers are in a pretty good position to know who their users are and aren't. We imagine there's going to be a multiplicity of those. And this, again, assumes kind of the DMA scope for lots of smaller providers that are scrappy and competitive. Because there is a fear, I guess I'll put it, that message service providers might advertise themselves as routes to users they shouldn't. We've also talked quite a bit about a concept we call authenticated mappings. And what do we mean by that? Well, a mapping is basically a cryptographic document. I think it's something that's signed that shows a relationship between the identifiers for a user and a message service platform at which those identifiers are available. And I'm being a little fuzzy about identifier at the moment because I'm going to get to another consensus point here in a sec. But the key part here is that relying parties, we expect, trust the signers of those mappings, which might not necessarily be the DP, or even in some cases an MSP. but some independent entity that is actually responsible for authenticating the mappings. And we'll talk about at least one model for that in one of the few slides we have not yet gotten to as we go through this. But what is discovery really? Discovery queries use identifiers as a key. We've gone around in the terminology a few times. These terms SII and SSI that we previously used are just way too easy to mistake for one another. The current proposal is that instead of SII, let's use cross-platform identifier, or CPI, which seems sufficiently distinct from the concept of a service-specific identifier, which I, again, here mistake in parentheses after it, because you mistake it like every time you put it down on a slide. But we keep SSI as it is. So does that sound okay? I mean, are CPI and SSI sufficiently differentiable that we can work with that? Rowan, are you clapping?
CPI is so much better than having another thing with an S. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. If somebody comes up with something better, we can change it again. But
no, let's not.
Be a huge improvement.
Yeah, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I think this is good enough. Let's just do like CPI and SSI. Yes, Ecker.
I agree. I agree. This is an improvement. I guess I don't find these names quite as intuitive as others might. And I realize my video is not working properly. I'll fix that in a second. I mean, it seems like that the property of the CPIs is globally unique, and the property of the SSI is locally unique. That is the distinction we're trying to draw, right? So yeah. I do wonder if global and local are the right words here, but I don't propose to workshop it here. Certainly, if we can't have anything better, this is an improvement. And I see you did observe that that there's an error on that second bullet. That's demonstrating your point.
Yes, it is. Okay, Tim, what do you think? Should we keep these, or should we go for something global and local? What do you think?
I think definitely what you have is better. My only thought is that it's a little awkward that one of them says platform and the other one says service. It seems like they should either both say platform or both say service, because otherwise, if I see the two of these terms, I go, well, wait, does a platform and a service mean the same thing in this context? I think they do, right? Anyway. So I wonder if, say, cross-platform identifier and then platform-specific identifier is better.
PSI sounds pretty. It sounds like psionics. We're getting back. And sorry, I'm looking at the D&D buff. Mind powers, right? I get with PSI. I mean, I think in terms of how we ended up scoping this instead of global and local. I mean, the one thing I'd say, Ecker, about that is that it's not that an SSI, if you have one, is not globally routable, right? It is, in fact, specific to the service, but like John at transunion.com or whatever, right, is still it's still global in a sense. And so, as I think more about that distinction, I'm not sure that's quite it, but if you'd like to go to bat for it, please do.
Well, I'm not sure I want to go back for the text, but maybe sure I understand the concept, right? Is that in the context of email, John at transunion.com is unique. Because it is universally routable. But if you have, say, an account on iMessage that is John at transunion.com and an account on WhatsApp, that is not even though they came from a global unique space, they're not globally unique in this space. And in fact, you need like John at transunion.com at iCloud.com or something to make that work, right?
And obviously, Twitter style identifiers have even worse properties, right? In the sense, or take your pick of Facebook, Twitter, where you just have a name at this, for Twitter, right? That you can DM to, and so that certainly is not in any meaningful sense global. What do you think about CPI versus PSI? Is that good enough?
I had to restart, so I didn't hear what PSI stands for.
That would be, so Tim's intervention there was just that CPI has platform, whereas SSI has service. And he's like, is there a difference between platform and service? And so he was like, well, can we have like a cross-platform identifier and then a platform-specific identifier?
I could live with that.
Okay, why don't we do that? Good, I like that. Minute that, if no one further objects to this. We just need to be done with this because we've been arguing about this like forever. And so throughout this presentation anyway, I've switched everything out to refer to CPI instead of SII because I'm so tired of not getting SII or SSI right. A final point then to capture on this slide is, and this just is something that has come up again and again, so that I think it's worth noting, is that discovery is not like explicitly mandated by the DMA. What we're doing here is like extra credit work. And the purpose of that extra credit work is to try to create like a helpful and consistent user experience, right? And going above and beyond to kind of make sure that this will work relatively seamlessly. But that also means that a lot of the times when we ask ourselves something about discovery and say, is this really in the spirit of the DMA? We don't have a lot of purchase. There's not like usually text we're going to be able to point to that's going to tell us whether or not something is in the spirit of DMA related to discovery in particular. And I just want to make sure that we're all noting that. Next slide, please. All right, this is more of a laundry list. I think the first bullet here has kind of been my North Star in thinking about all this. And I think Richard Barnes was the one who maybe first cast it that way, that the discovery problem is twofold, because of the potential trust issues about MSPs publishing mappings and DPs accepting and distributing them. There has to be some kind of authentication mechanism that overall message service platforms are going to trust in order to treat mappings as authenticated. And, it's not up to us to define what the trust roots are for that. We are going to talk a little bit more about this in a couple slides, but like that is, I think, a key piece that is separate from the piece of distribution. And this is kind of the crucial insight of this twofold problem. When we think about the discovery provider, we're thinking about an entity that's in the business of aggregating these authenticated mappings that potentially point to many platforms from CPIs. And what, the distribution problem for that is separate from the problem of how we establish the trust in those authenticated mappings. And treating those as two separable problems, I think, is really important to the approach we're considering here. And we hope obviates a lot of the problems that, we might encounter otherwise with trust in the overall architecture. Second point here is that discovery acts on CPIs. If you already have an SSI, if you already have a service-specific identifier and know that it's for Twitter or whatever, you don't need discovery. And this is something that, I think we've danced around a bit, but I feel like we have pretty strong consensus for. The discovery problem is not figuring out if you've got one SSI, how do you find another SSI for that person or something like that. This is a case where probably somebody who wants to send a message or form a contact or get some form of consent, all they have for them is a CPI, and it's discovery's job to be able to get you connected to MSPs where the user responsible for that CPI has a service. We spent a lot, especially of the last interim, going through various models for how we might approach a discovery provider. I think and even in Brisbane, we did a bit. I think I heard rough support. I'm not sure I'd say rough consensus, but at least reasonable support for the concept that there would be a logical singleton DP. In other words, the information may be distributed down through multiple discovery providers, but there is some deterministic way that when you launch a discovery query, it's going to get to the right place for you to get the answers that you are eligible to get. Having looked at a lot of those architectures and kind of debated their respective merits, though, I think what I took away from the consensus of the group is we should really design the protocol in as architecture neutral a way as possible. Something that'll work irrespective of who it is that operates the discovery provider service, and ultimately irrespective of who it is that is going to end up querying it. And there are, significant potential architectural directions. We would be guided by whether we expect 1 billion individual handsets are going to be the things querying DPs versus just MSPs, right, querying DPs. But, I think what I've taken away from our discussion so far is let's just look at this more from a bits on the wire perspective than getting overly concerned about, prescribing that to work kind of well for one way or well for the other way. Similarly, we talked a bit about when discovery happens. Is discovery something that happens in real time when I'm sending a message? Suddenly it is my MSP's job to go do discovery, or maybe it's even my user agent's job to go and do discovery and then tell the MSP, this is the choice that I had. Or, we looked at options like when I create an account at an MSP? Does it kind of go through my contact book and do discovery for all of those individuals that, I might be messaging? And, again, I think we came away with the same consensus that we're really going to look at this more agnostically, something that should be able to work in any of those kinds of cases. Another point, and this is a bit of a sore point for me still, and I think I may end up ranting about this a bit when we get to the open issues slide. I think people are generally unconcerned about enforcing fairness in discovery. What do I mean by fairness? This would be the possibility of bias that could be introduced by a discovery provider being operated by, say, a message service platform, right? In which case there is an opportunity for a message service platform to be able to prefer itself, for example, if it thinks that, well, certainly if I have, a mapping from the CPI to a local user, that should be the one that you want to use in these cases. I think really what I took away from that discussion is people felt that this was just not something we could technically prescribe. In other words, that this would be a matter for policies and maybe even at regulatory level policies to make sure that people treat this fairly. Ecker.
I'm actually a little surprised by that assertion. So maybe let's talk about the underlying, and there's some discussion in the chat too. So it may bear on this.
I need chat open here.
Yeah. So the model that I had in my head was effectively, I mean, at least conceptually, the user would publish the credential would belong to the user, and the user would publish, the records into this vast database, right? And that one of the things they publish in the records will be the list of, if I hold john@transunion.com, that I'd assume that I would then digitally sign, a record that said you could reach me at WhatsApp and iMessage and this, and so that'd be my opportunity to provide a priority list. Is that not the model other people have in their heads?
Yes, this is real interesting. And, I might suggest we defer this until the open issue slide, because I did, in fact, already write some text on the open issue slide, which is coming up, that where I vent about this, because I also agree that I'm not particularly happy with the way this previous discussion went around this. And, I don't want to constantly relitigate our previous consensus points, but I think we do need to spend a little bit more time on that. But let me suggest we defer that. We're going to get to, we only have 2 slides. And honestly, the slide right before the open issue gets to that. Okay. And so let's defer that discussion for then. It does, I agree. There are ways that if we architect the system to be very agnostic to all the things that we said in the first 2 bullets, the first 2 sub-bullets above there, though, about how the singleton DP works, it does get harder to make the argument that this is achievable, that fairness in some sense like that is achievable. We'll get to this, though, in a sec. And finally, the last point we had is that we agree that discovery is not about finding a common capability between platform. In other words, it's not discovery's job to run some offer answer process by which when I say, okay, I want to send a message to the CPI, here's, I am on platforms A, B, C, and D, go find for this target, the owner or whatever, the addressee of the CPI, go find what platforms they're on. Now let's take the intersection of those. And from that is what kind of gets returned by discovery. I think we generally had agreement that, why don't you go to the next slide, because I get into this immediately. We generally had agreement that we're much more interested in the receiver being able to set any kind of preferences than we are in the sender being able to set preferences. And we talked a bit about what sender preferences might look like. If there's a sender who hates some particular message service platform for some reason and refuses to interact with them, I think we treated that as something that probably their home MSP, that is the MSP through whom they are trying to send a message or trying to establish a contact or whatever, would be able to help them manage that. I think there was also a general consensus that we try to keep this simple. We've had extensive experience in real-time protocols and real-time communications here in the last 2 decades with trying to do things with caller preferences or callee preferences that can require effectively like policy documents, right, that are going to be uploaded, and, you know, being able to anticipate things about who's contacting you that would allow you to populate those documents could be very, very difficult. But at the same time, I think I also heard from just too many people in the last interim, you know, that we want some kind of way to sort incoming requests into contexts. You know, Rowan, I think, had an analogy of the, you know, the away email you get when you send an email to someone who's on vacation. And, you know, what you get back is, if this is an emergency, if you're at, you know, if it's an emergency and you're asking about this, use this as my contact. If it's something else about this, use this as my contact. Like some kind of way that you can tell people how to reach you for those particular contexts being a component of this. And this is really where we ran out of time last time. We pretty much gotten to this point where I think we understood this is a hard problem. We heard everybody say we want to keep it simple. And like, you know, as Alyssa pointed out, it's not like we got this right for email in the sense of all the time our emails seem to bleed between our work and personal contexts based on, you know, who we may have given a mail to for what particular circumstance. And, you know, we don't want to boil the ocean here. But, you know, I think we do need to have a little bit more conversation about this, because it was a bit truncated at the end of the last interim, about what does it really look like. What kind of thing do we think we want receivers, you know, potential receivers, to be able to express? And then who do we actually expect to like enforce that? Who do we expect is going to do the work that is going to, you know, affect those preferences in the discovery process? And so, you know, I really kind of want to open this to the floor on this. I'm not sure I know how to do this, and that makes me nervous. Like, you know, short of, I mean, I can imagine a world where, again, users do have this direct security relationship with DPs, and there is some kind of a policy document that we identify. Maybe it's a, you know, JOT or something, right? That can be filled out potentially by the user interface a user has to their MSP that gets pushed to the DP, and it's the DP's job when discovery requests come in for that user to like read that stuff and use that to determine what subset of the authenticated mappings it holds it returns to the user. I could also imagine a way this works where it really is kind of local to your home MSP, that is the MSP through whom you are sending a request or whatever. And like, it in turn gets all of the authenticated mappings the DP is eligible to give you. And when I say eligible, I mean due to geopolitical constraints or whatever, right? Like, you know, and then that home MSP sorts through that stuff, right? And kind of shows those to the user and says, these are the things this receiver is willing to accept. So Ecker, help us out on this, because I don't know what to do.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to solve the problem here, but I mean, my mental model of this system, as I think I alluded to a minute ago, is effectively that there is a free-floating database of, you know, of assertions from endpoints, and that those assertions are consumed by other endpoints who then do things with them, and that the and that the, you know, the MSPs have very little to do with it. Now, as a practical matter, you know, we also face the problem that we are not chartered to specify any of the client to MSP, you know, behaviors. And so if the MSPs choose to like do, you know, how the MSPs choose to divide the work between the endpoint and themselves is like, is out of scope for this protocol. But I certainly would, but so, I mean, so my mental model was effectively that some combination of the endpoint and the MSP would consume, as you suggested, the entire list of mappings that were eligible, and then would sort through them, and that those mappings might come with annotations about like, you know, this is actually my work phone, this is my home phone, whatever. But that like how that selection happened would be like out of scope for the for our discussion. I don't know how to do like better than that, really. I don't think I think enforces is a very strong term here. I think maybe enables is more like the right term, or acknowledges, namely, this document says, this is my work phone, it's my home phone, but like really you can't stop me from like calling you on your work phone, on your home phone, like if we published it, right? And even for work reasons. So I don't think we're going to be enforcing it. I guess I would not want to build an architecture that precluded the MSP being like really dumb and letting the endpoint do it. But I think that's probably the best we're going to be able to do.
Yeah, and we did kind of dance around that issue a bit, as well as the issue of how much metadata, I think in the previous interim, or maybe in Brisbane, I think the previous interim, how much metadata we expected would be included with authenticated mappings. And there's certainly a path to this where the mapping itself, right, contains all the preference data that you might want. And yeah, whatever the security association is that creates that mapping, then it's in that binding, and so you kind of know that this is authentically what the user wanted in this instance. But I think your caveat about the division between the endpoint and the MSP here is well taken, and is something that makes it profoundly difficult to say what the distinction really is in a lot of these cases, especially for these MSPs who effectively, your client is your web interface to the MSP, right? Where like what capabilities do you have, or what interaction to discovery do you have that is not so mediated by the MSP that it becomes moot? Certainly, we don't want to preclude that there could be MSPs that choose to architect things in a way where the endpoints have like considerably more power and independence, I guess. But it seems to be the dominant case at this point, right, where that distinction between the endpoint and the MSP is incredibly difficult to draw. And because we can't really prescribe it here, it does give us a lot of limitations. I haven't really been able to follow the chat that much because I am talking too much, but anything else from the chat, or anybody else kind of want to weigh in on how we might express receiver preferences and whose job it is to make sure that they are dealt with in some fashion? Come on. Somebody has a view about this. Tim,
Just
rescue
because you seem lonely. I guess I agree with that Kurt's point that it was a tricky problem here of not wading into client to MSP interactions, but it seems like there is a need to define some format for these things and explain how providers would exchange them between each other. Then, I mean, Mimi either like shouldn't or couldn't possibly then dictate what a provider will do with them, but the like encoding of the object that contains the receiver preferences presumably has to be specified as an inter-provider interaction.
Well, that's what would be handy about declaring it just metadata of the mapping itself, right? Because I mean, again, that isn't necessarily provider to provider, though we are going to talk about this, about whether to what degree the provider has to be part of the mapping, since what it is the mapping expresses is not a route to the user, it's a route to the MSP. And we'll get back to this in a second. I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion about this on that slide. But yeah, it is attractive, I think, to think about this as just data that would be metadata of the mapping itself, because then it is wrapped up in that security association. Yes, Femi, please join us. Good to see you. I feel like I never talk to you, Femi. This is
oh, no worries. We talk every now and then.
Just every now and then.
I think one of the challenges with the receiver preferences is that the receiver will have presence in multiple MSPs and potentially multiple DPs, and then having like a global object that kind of represent the user preferences across all the service is a little bit challenging. Where would that preference be stored? Will it be stored across those DPs? And also, what are the potential privacy concerns with that, right? I don't want my preferences to be broadcast to everybody. So it's a little bit challenging.
Yeah, I mean, that is a consequence of building the preferences into the mappings themselves, is that those mappings would be communicated. And if your preferences is like, I never want to talk to Jonathan Lennox, because man, I'm tired of that guy, right? Like, yeah, you don't want that to be something Jonathan Lennox can download. So there are probably privacy issues like that. And we do have a privacy slide we're going to get to in a sec as well. Anybody else in on this before I move on? And this is really the end. This is just me trying to wrap up what we did not quite get to at the end of the last session before we get into fresh stuff. Okay, so I mean, taking away from that, I'm hearing some support for, making sure that we know that Jonathan, did you want to?
Yeah, hi, sorry. Yeah, I'm taking offense and making you hear from me. Actually, no. I was going to say, the other tricky thing is if you are attaching these to the mappings, then you have the problem of what if the mappings disagree on the preferences? You've got a preference list A on mapping A and preference list B on mapping B, and they disagree. I'm sure that could cause all kinds of interesting havoc.
It could. I mean, I think, this preference would be more like, say context was what I was imagining, where like this, all the metadata you're adding to this authenticated mapping this is my work context. But you can have precisely the same problem where, multiple MSPs publish, authenticated mappings that say, yes, this user is available on me, this MSP, for the purposes of work communication. And what do you do then? Well, I think the short answer is you render those, right, to, or, again, however this then would be worked out, you render those to the people that should only be seeing you through your work context. And that is, there's a lot of other architecture that would be required to make that work. Yes. Tim.
So Jonathan Lennox's point just now made me think that I think one issue with rolling these preferences into the authenticated mapping is that then there's, I think, some confusion about who is being trusted to attest to what information. So like the discovery provider, which I think as we're agreeing is going to be the MSP in many cases, is being trusted to authenticate the mapping from CPI to PSI. We may or may not like that, but that's what we sort of agreed is the idea. But it's the user who ought to be, like the recipient, that user who ought to be like expressing their preferences. Like, it's not clear to me that we want to trust the DP/MSP to be able to like arbitrarily forge or create recipient preferences on behalf of their users. So it's like maybe possibly you want the object that's if you embed it in the authenticated mapping at all, like maybe you want like a further signature but chains back to some like user identity. Or it's a separate object that is just signed by some user identity, like with some public key that you obtain via the authenticated mapping. I'm being very hand wavy here about a lot of key distribution problems, of course. But I think let me rephrase in terms of the actual problem that I'm concerned about rather than poorly sketched out solutions. I wonder if we should avoid allowing DPs to synthesize user preferences for receiving messages.
We can definitely note that as an anti-requirement. Again, I think because of that difficulty I mentioned, the conflation of the MSP with the endpoint in so many cases, kind of penetrating the MSP veil and getting to something that is of the user, or something we're going to talk about in a minute, but like is tricky. And I wouldn't say that it's immediately obvious how you can do that in a way that I would trust 100%. But Ecker.
Yeah, I concur with the general attempt the phrasing here. This is like saying we'd like to avoid if we can avoid it with some difficulty. I do think I guess I don't there's any I think that like in many cases as you say it will not be possible to prevent my DP from like lying to me about your preferences. I think that what would be desirable would be, I think, prevent one of your DPs from lying about your preferences to other people. Obviously, the extent to which this assumes, this cut between the, the authentication provider and the DP, which we know may not in fact be a real, the MSP, which may in fact not be a real thing. But like, if we pretend that the MSP, that the authentication providers are in fact trusted and are not cheating, then it should not be the case that your MSP should be able to lie about your preferences. And then if it is the case that you have one of the MSPs is also an authentication provider, then I guess we're just kind of like, then we have a different problem. But like the MSP, qua MSP, as opposed to qua authentication provider, hopefully not lie about your preferences would be a nice target at least. I think we may have exhausted the slide.
Yes, we should move on. Yes, I was trying to get there. But yeah. But again, I don't think we exhausted that slide through consensus about what we're supposed to do. I think we exhausted that slide by deepening our confusion, right? And there's like work and stuff we would need to understand, even capture what the requirements are that we were kind of feeling around there. So let's not fool ourselves with that was progress. It was good, but it's not getting us where we need to be. All right, next slide. Okay. This is something we have not talked about at all yet in the whatever going on 5 hours of discussion we've had about these requirements. First one's pretty important. Are the mappings aggregated at DPs private? And I'd like to hear from as many people here that may care about this. What are those mappings again? Well, they're not even, and this is a slight correction on what Tim said earlier, I think our consensus is they're not quite mappings from a CPI to a PSI. They are in fact mappings from a CPI to an MSP. And at that MSP, there may in fact be a PSI. And in some cases, just knowing your CPI at the MSP's name is in fact a PSI. So, I mean, in some cases it's moot, but do people feel like it is sensitive information that an identifier like a telephone number is active for a given user at a given message service platform? Or do people think that is not sensitive? Anyone want to express an opinion? Travis.
Yes, it is sensitive.
Okay.
Could you repeat that one more time, please, John? You kind of cut out for me.
Sorry. Yeah. So the question is, are the mappings held at DPs privacy sensitive? Is the information that a particular CPI is resident at a particular MSP itself sensitive private information? Ecker.
I think the question whether it's sensitive is only the beginning of the analysis. Yes, in some sense it is sensitive. I have not heard any story for how we're going to protect it in a meaningful way. In a world where, in a world where that is effectively a permissionless world for becoming an MSP that allows you to query DPs, there's simply not enough humans in the world to make exhaustively querying the DP a problematic situation. So I think anybody who says sensitive better come up with a story about how they're going to actually limit access to the information.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard rate limit-ish stories.
Yeah, sure.
Not any serious way to prevent enumeration attack.
Yeah.
Because what would that be? What possible mechanism could you use to prevent an enumeration attack other than that?
That's my thesis. Yes. I mean, this is a database of order, order 10 to the 10th entries. It's just not that big, right? And the relevant size is much, much smaller. So unless your principle is now, I mean, I think if you're willing to import the principle that you cannot make a query for somebody without their permission, then you'd be getting somewhere. But that's a new behavioral requirement. I mean, if I don't see how I can contact you without your assistance. Spin is an example of something that actually doesn't try to take this seriously, right? But if you're going to have the simultaneous requirements that I can learn on a retail basis people's mappings without their permission, then I don't see how enumeration attacks are really practical to prevent.
I mean, the other spin on this too. We talked a bit last time about who we expected talk to the DP, and in a world where we expect the DP has to basically accept open calls from anyone who asks. There's one threat model, but if you assume it's actually just MSPs with whom, maybe even MSPs in a federation with each other who are the only people who are eligible to be able to query each other's DPs or something, then of course, yes, if there's one MSP that feels like misbehaving and is acting on behalf of the user, it can do the same enumeration attack itself. But at least it raises the bar a bit on this, right?
Yeah.
If you,
I mean, I think that's true if you think that it's that the cardinality of the MSP list is single digits, right? But if you think that any clown could stand one up, then I think it becomes a much more difficult problem, right?
Well, but even if it's 200, it's different than 3 billion, right? That's my point. If anybody can talk to it.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe you're right.
You have to log into the DP. You have to have an account, right? And it can keep track of what you're asking about and things like that. I think it's a different world than any enhancements in the world.
I mean, my sense is that any of the big any of the big MSPs essentially end up with the entire database at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
Now whether the and any large size DB can end up with the database they choose to simply by, like you will be querying a large massive database over the course of time, right? So I think so I think we should be modest about this, about our claim here, because we may wish it was sensitive, but I'm not sure how to keep it really pretty.
Okay, that's a good data point. And just before you go, DKG, I have heard it asserted by at least one representative of a gatekeeper provider that these things are not sensitive, right? Like that this should be effectively public information, that indeed it is for a lot of these gatekeepers already, what the set of CPIs are that are reachable through them as an MSP. And so that just as a data point, I have heard like the hard contrary of that, that this is not sensitive at all. With that, DKG, please.
Hi. I don't know whether this is sensitive or not. I'm actually interested in hearing people whether they think that this particular property is sensitive or not. But I want to observe that the architecture that we're talking about that would treat it as sensitive smells a lot like the architecture for the current mobile phone network, which does a terrible job at actually, if this data is actually sensitive, it is trivial enough to become a mobile network operator that anyone with moderate resources who's interested in violating whatever this supposed sensitivity is can do it. And that's one of the reasons why people don't think the mobile network actually works very well, because there's a lot of things that anyone can do if they just manage to become a network operator. So if we're claiming that this is sensitive material, and our story is, but don't worry, we're going to do the way the mobile phone network did it, that's not a great outcome.
Fair enough. Rowan.
Hey, so I agree with DKG, but I mean, as it comes as no surprise, like my main reason why I don't think that this discovery work is actually very important is because I hope that before this discovery work becomes complete, that we will have a MIME protocol that allows people to completely sidestep this problem by never using a CPI at all that doesn't come with an explicit name of a provider. So I think we're kind of hedging our bets here that there are people like there are people like me who are like, let's just go and like I'm gonna concentrate most of my efforts on solving that problem, and I'm gonna try to make clients and providers user interfaces that make it really easy to go and interoperate with somebody else without ever having to trust a discovery provider. But yeah, I'm not convinced that this is a tractable problem, but I've been kind of going along with the process. So.
No, I'm not convinced it's a tractable problem either. The last 5 hours of slides I've put up are all questions with very few answers. So yes, I'm with you. Okay, well that's good, and I think we can take away from that merely punting this to the MSPs, even to be the sole interactors with the DPs, doesn't address the core problem of enumeration attacks, and it would be extremely difficult to try to figure out how to make this genuinely private information. Second bullet. So to what degree do users need to be involved and indeed consent to the creation of mapping? And this is going to spill over into the next slide a little bit. Clearly, we know we don't want to end up in a world where MSPs are just able to assert, well, this CPI is available in my network. Here's an authenticated mapping from me that says this is the case. We have some thinking about that's going to come up in the next slide. But to what degree, users need to participate to create mappings? If we imagine that MSPs and DPs are the same things, or colluding with each other, clearly, I think it's very important for users to participate in the process that create mappings. Is there anybody here? And I'll put this cautiously, because we need to be honest too about the fact that there's a lot of legacy users of messaging platforms, and it's not like we're going to get some of these gatekeepers with a zillion users to like go through some process other than somebody just saying our terms of service have changed, quit if you don't like them, in order to go through some kind of like one-by-one consent process with people, right? In order to get them to consent to this. Though, as people have pointed out here previously, the DMA does kind of have this opt-in-ish thing to it. So it might be that we could kind of pin this to that. But I think people have enough use of this already so Travis, please.
Yeah, on the consent side, I don't necessarily think that it's a problem that we should be solving. I think it's important for consent. That's a more personal belief. But from the Mimi side of things, we should be designing something that is capable of both consent or lack of consent, like leave this up to the actual MSPs or these DPs rather, to decide if they will just take their entire existing user base and just publish it onto this provider, or if they will reach out to their 3 billion users and just ask, like, hey, click this button to be discoverable. Yeah, I think that we should kick this problem to the MSPs and DPs in particular.
Okay, Ecker, we need a requirement here.
I think it's going to be hard to write a requirement here, to be honest. So I think, consent, obviously, as sort of Travis indicates, is not really a technical kind of question for protocol. You can imagine, of course, a technical requirement, as I sort of alluded to earlier, that nominally requires the user's participation, namely some sort of digital signature from the user, as you alluded to at the very beginning of this discussion. But I think, again, with this kind of vague, this vague interaction between the DP and the MSP, I think it's very hard to talk about. Let us stipulate this architecture, which I sort of was floating earlier, where there's some key that a certificate that is acquired in some unspecified fashion from some third-party certificate authority that has the user identity in it, and they use that to sign this document. And so. But in the practical case, is that implemented? Does any given provider implement that by actually having end-to-end, key material on the client, or is it implemented that by having a server key and then the client just completes effectively the Acme, validation check, and then but that basically just persuades the CA that the server is acting for the client. And so in that case, oh yes, there's absolutely a signature that ties back to the certificate, but really it was all done at the MSP. And so I think we should design something which, I think a theme here is we should design something which is consistent with end-to-end properties, but actually enforcing those end-to-end properties is not a practical story given the design of the system. And that, by the way, is true for even for systems, since there's a chat about email, email nominally is an end-to-end system, but we all know it's perfectly possible to make an email system where all the actual email mechanics happen on the server, and it's called webmail, Right. And so even though that's nominally an end-to-end system with clients, actually it's not. And so I think the best we can do is make something that's compatible with end-to-end semantics, which I think we should do.
Okay, good. Jonathan?
Yeah, given that if we're assuming that there's some sort of Acme process by which you verify the mapping, I don't see how you avoid having the user involved in that process, at least insofar as this is, text a security code to the user and have them type it into the app.
So just to be clear, what I meant was, I agree with what you just said, but what I mean is that could eventually be implemented by having the user, so if you imagine I'm served by, I'm served by some Java server somewhere, right? And I connect to that Java server with a client, that server actually just goes and initiates that Acme exchange, and I prove ownership of the thing, but to a key that is actually owned by the Java server. And from then on, it just publishes whatever it wants the database, right? So yeah, you're right, they have to be involved in the authentication transaction, but that doesn't mean that they're involved in any subsequent transaction.
Okay, yeah, it's just the thinking about what the user experience is there's definitely a user experience of I'm doing something actively. It's not just that, WhatsApp is publishing their entire database.
I agree.
Yeah. DKG.
So it seems to me like the only architecture that will actually require that the user consent in any meaningful way is an architecture where the mapping must be in some way sort of certified or signed by the user's own key, and it's the key that is the long-term key that needs to be visible to the rest of the MLS communication, right? So if the assertion that this mapping is present does not in some way include a signature from the subject's key itself, subject's long-term signing key, then we are not going to be able to require that the user participate in this. Now, like Eric said, it is possible that someone will implement a webmail-ish version of this where the user doesn't even control their long-term signing keys, period, and we can't solve that problem. But if we don't say that the mapping needs to include a sort of, I mean, in the OpenPGP terms, we would call it a self-sig, then the MSPs will be able to forge these things, and as an end user, you won't be able to confirm that, yes, the other person actually consented to this mapping.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there are also, indicators that don't replace that, but are good, I guess, correlation indicators. And I think things along the line of what Jonathan was describing a minute ago, where, yeah, like you get an SMS and you enter in a key, right? Or something that shows not just a key owner has this, but that the person the CPI is associated with. In other words, you're doing this not for the key's sake, but for the CPI sake.
Okay, but there's two questions here, right? One is, does the key holder agree that their CPI should be published? That this association that doesn't stop anyone from publishing an unverified assertion of ownership of the CPI, right?
No, I got it. And we think, unfortunately, that is likely to happen for cases that have huge legacy installed bases of this. But my point is, if you get like the SMS to your phone, right, and you have the choice to, say, put in the 6-digit number or not, right? You are consenting when you do this. And so what I don't want to do is say it's just the key, because I want that binding to the CPI itself and the proof of the CPI's ownership to be part of the security association as well.
Right, but the CPI doesn't have any cryptographic material associated with it. So there's no way for the peer, the other end user, to confirm that CPI does agree to it, right? That mechanism simply isn't there. If you give me a phone number and you say, here's an assertion that this phone number made, I can't verify that on my own on the other side.
Well,
I think it's a great idea to involve the user's consent in the process of actually creating that. But on the other hand, when the user does have a long-term signing-based key, I do think that that should be verifiable end-to-end on the other side to say that, yes, this key does agree that this email address, that this phone number or whatever, sorry, I'm not using the obscure acronyms we've introduced in this conversation. But I don't think that that we should necessarily distribute I don't think that the client that's looking at this, we should be able to say that the client needs to be able to tell whether or not the key holder agrees to this mapping. And I think that's pretty straightforward to do. We know how to do it, and I don't see why we wouldn't do it. Leaving it out is effectively saying that clients in general will trust these mappings even if the user hasn't agreed to them. And I would like to be able to say this client will not trust mappings that the user hasn't agreed to as a way of putting back pressure on publishing arbitrary, unbound, non-self-signed associations.
So this has already become full on the subject of the next slide, which is entirely about just this. And this slide, we're just trying to, I think, get the privacy part of this of consent, but I guess we should either switch to the next slide or like dig into privacy or one or the other. But Ecker, sorry.
I'm happy to I was going to follow up on DKG, so I'm happy to pause that or however you like to lead the discussion.
Right. I mean, I guess the consent point that we thought was important to get into this slide was much more that privacy dimension of it. Again, this is like riffing on the previous bullet of like, how sensitive do we think this information is? Does the user need to kind of consent to mapping creation from a privacy perspective? Or Femi, do you want to give more? So I think these
I think you need to cover bullet point 4. the fourth bullet point, I think is really important in this slide. The last bullet point. Can you go over that?
You mean the mitigates MSP to DP collusion scenario?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we did kind of go over that already in the sense of when we talk about the creation of mappings, we're extremely concerned about cases where the MSP and the DP are kind of mutually misrepresenting, right? That a user is actually at the service or indeed has consented to use the service, or to be that its CPI should be a recipient of messages at that service. We've been kind of talking about this whole time, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the one we haven't spoken about is how do we protect the discovery process? I'm a user, I want to discover your the service your CPI is associated with. How is that query protected? I think that is what is covered in the last bullet point, that we think the requirement should be that we should either protect your IP address that is doing the query, or we protect the content of the query.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even gotten to spam prevention yet. I was just doing the fourth sub-bullet there. So why don't we finish this up, and then we'll dig back into the much more interesting conversation about how we prove identities and what we actually think these mappings tell us, if anything, at the end of the day. So this is something else that came out again of Jonathan's original draft here. You know, I mean, as somebody who has been the recipient of a great deal of SMS spam over the years, and indeed someone who looks a lot at robocalling and its related problems, you know, I often say that CPIs, like telephone numbers, they're kind of front door identifiers in the sense that like a lot of people know them and it's the front door people come to knock on. And, you know, there's a degree to which I think it's almost like a lost cause to look at, you know, building spam prevention into discovery for CPIs, because CPIs are such public identifiers that, you know, we just end up inheriting all of the spam problems that we are so familiar with from both email and from the telephone network. But, you know, since this was listed as a requirement in Jonathan's original document, I wanted to raise this here in particular. Do we feel like the discovery provider or the way we architect the discovery service overall has some spam prevention obligation that is going to get us traction on these matters? Ecker.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought this requirement was like somewhat misguided for many of the reasons you're indicating. It seems to me that there are two different scenarios. One of which is where the so first of all, as you observed earlier, the assumption here is that the information that's published is not the SSI or PSI, but rather is the identity of the provider itself. So it just says this phone number or whatever is the CPI is accessible at this provider. So it seems like there are two scenarios there. One of which is the one where that identifier, that PSI is deterministic from the CPI and that information, namely where, you know, where it's your phone number at, you know, apple.com, and the other is where it's not deterministic, namely, you know, it is like my phone number goes to, you know, docidus to apple.com or whatever. And like in the second scenario, you're getting very little traction from this information. And in the first scenario, like as a practical matter, like the size of the most relevant providers have a very large fraction of the identifier space. And so as a practical matter, I can simply just try, I can skip the entire discovery process and just, you know, and just spam out like every phone number at apple.com. And like, you know, only, you know, we'll say a 1 order of magnitude, you know, like loss in effectiveness. So that doesn't seem like that big a deal. I think, you know, this entire, like, the evidence that like concealing email identifiers is like a meaningful anti-spam protection measure, I think is extraordinarily thin. And so yes, I'm pretty you know, and in a world, frankly, where, you know, you can't even send a phone number without someone send an SMS without someone knowing who you are, and like nevertheless we have like a huge amount of SMS spam. I just think that like this is you know, spam is bad, but like this does not seem like an effective measure. So I think probably I think from that perspective, if we simply were to publish the entire database, I would not be very stressed out about spam. Now maybe there are reasons for 1, 2, and 3 here, but I don't think that like but I don't think that the anti-spam reason is a strong reason.
So does anyone want to go to bat that it is in fact discovery's problem? It is part of the discovery requirements that we are preventing spam aimed at CPIs. Anybody here feel like we're dropping the ball if we don't do that? Travis.
I want to ask the, I guess, a counter question or clarifying question on that. Are we saying that this is to prevent spam on like the lookups, or is this to prevent spam to the, I guess, underlying human that may be operating that account?
Underlying human. I mean, again, does the discovery provider have an obligation to somehow, we can imagine ways, right, that we could try, prevent spam as part of discovery? I mean, this is related to the above questions about like, how public mappings are, right, and things like that. Because we could imagine architecting a very different system if we had a requirement to minimize, nuisance bulk interactions. That would start steering us down the path to, well, we need to architect DPs in a way where you need to have security associations with them, where it's going to be difficult or more difficult to get the information about which MSPs are associated with particular CPIs, things like that.
Yeah, I guess in that case, I would say it's not a strong requirement. I think we should have some measures, like at least basic rate limiting or recommendations therein. But I don't think we need to, I guess, overly design a whole system to prevent worldwide spam. I mean, there are other mechanisms both within MIMI and within the providers themselves, which will help reduce the chances of certain scams, for instance, and other types of spam from getting through to users. And I think focusing on those measures, which I believe actually, now I'm thinking about it, we can't work on this as part of the charter. But yeah, like those sorts of mechanisms would be within the providers themselves. So it would be after discovery. I don't think it's necessarily the problem of discovery to solve that.
That is my intuition as well, is that this is a post-discovery issue for MIMI, and other people working on requirements here can put it in their requirements so we don't have to. Or even punt it entirely so that this is indeed just a matter of the MSP to endpoint interactions. Okay. No one else is going back to that. Then we'll get down to the last bit here. This is what Femi was speaking to earlier. How we can protect discovery from data collection threats. I think we do have some pretty significant obligations in this space. We definitely want to prevent correlation threats between people that are looking at both discovery queries and the messages. And this is part of the work that Femi and Giles, submitted as inputs to discovery, more than 6 months ago now, that, there are a variety of ways that we can try to make sure that the discovery provider and the message service provider do not learn undue information about the targets of discovery or the origin points of discovery. And so the current thinking as to what we put in a requirement is captured just in these bottom 3 bullets here. You're either going to be hiding the IP address of the querier from the MSP or the DP with something like IP blinding, or take your pick. And, that, or you can hide the data the MSP is requesting from a DP with something like PIR, which obviously does put, some obligations on the DP for implementing PIR. Tim, any thoughts about whether casting the requirement that way, you either got to do one or the other of these, or maybe you have a better idea, or maybe you have a complete recasting of the problem space, but like that is the thinking. What do you think?
So, sorry, the mention of IP blinding is interesting to me because I've been in a completely different context. I've been working on composing oblivious HTTP with like a different protocol. Oblivious HTTP is cool and good and strong, and it's been deployed. But what's interesting about it is that now you have like a further trusted party. So this is hairy for a few reasons. Like, for one thing, anybody deploying, if you mandate like, oh, you must do something like OHTTP, well, now anybody running this has to like go find a further party to like run an extra server. So there's like a cost thing there. There's like additional complexity. But also, I get concerned about like, I think some careful analysis is needed to reason through, does the trusted party doing whatever IP blinding or running the OHTTP relay, like, do they have to be distinct from the MSP or the DP? Like, is it okay for somebody to be 2 of these, but not all 3, stuff like that? Like, I think the threat models can get hairy, and we have to think carefully about like, well, how many like independent parties or plausibly independent parties now have to be involved in successfully running this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the IP blinding requirement that I heard being bounced around was that it had to be neither the MSP nor the DP that was doing that function. But Ecker.
So I think I think your the first bullet I think is the right is the right altitude for this discussion. The second bullet is how to solve this problem. I think that that's relevant for the question of whether the problem is soluble, which I believe it is. I think I think I'm just going to avoid the urge to dig into PIR versus IP blinding for the moment. But the problem is soluble, and I think the relevant question is it should never no single entity should ever learn both who's doing the query and what they're querying for, and even and a stronger requirement, a superior one that maybe not like possible or practical, is that the DP should not even learn which provider is searching for a given for a given CPI. That is practical in some circumstances and not others. I do not think saying that's the relevant requirement. I think this is actually in your document to the right level. I don't think it's a requirement that if then when you go and attempt to message somebody that you not learn not learn who it is. So I think I look up and I discover so just to concretize this. I look up and I discover that you are on iMessage. And then when I want to send you a message, I contact iMessage, and that should be like no one should learn that it's me and then you. And then when I go to actually send you a message, I like query iMessage and I get the key material or whatever. And I think that's like no one I think plausibly expects that is not going to involve revealing me and you at the same time.
Yes.
And one might wish that were not. I mean, I know there's like been discussion in MLS about like wishing that were not the case. And I get brand new millions points and whatever, but I think for the purpose of this discussion, I think like everyone kind of assumes that that's not how we're gonna land. So I think we trying to print that is not necessarily worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe not practical, or I suppose worthwhile.
Right. We definitely want people to know who they're talking to mutually, and like anything that like makes it so that information is being concealed from people in this, anything that takes it to that extreme seems to be kind of self-defeating for this, and so. DKG.
I think it's worth identifying who the parties are involved that we want to hide information from. So I would agree with you that for purposes of spam prevention, we would like the end user to know who is messaging them, right? So that's the recipient needs to know who the sender is. And we don't really imagine, I mean, certainly if somebody wants to, they can spin up a pseudonymous ephemeral identity and then that's who's doing the messaging. We don't imagine that we're going to try to hide the sender's identity from the recipient. But there is a question of who else needs to know this exact edge in the social graph, as Rohan may put it in the chat, right? So Rohan points out in the chat that the social graph, that connectivity of who's hopping, like who's connecting to who, that's the particularly valuable piece of information.
Yes.
And if we design these lookup mechanisms such that there's anyone other than the querier who knows both the querier's identity and the recipient's identity, then we are leaking social graph to that party.
Yep.
And so I think we should design this. So whether or not we manage to make the messaging system hide that information from, say, the delivering party, right? It could just look like someone coming from Mumble Messenger is sending a particular recipient at iMessage message, so that the iMessage provider doesn't know who particularly is sending and the Mumble Messenger doesn't know who is particularly receiving. You could design a system that way for the messaging. But let's not leak that pairwise information during the process of lookup on its own, because then that sort of precludes fixing things in the messaging layer itself. I think it is important that we try to design it that way. And I want to just, one other thing is to observe that there is a tension between this and attempting to hide the fact of a binding between a CPI and an MSP. If we say that we're going to try to defend which CPIs are associated with which MSPs as a sensitive piece of information, the likely defenses for that are to gate all of the queries through one of the MSPs, which means that the MSP is going to gate the query by trying to identify who's doing the query so that they themselves don't get flooded with Sybil attacks. And by definition, if we treat the binding between a CPI and an MSP as private, we may actually be forcing ourselves into a position of leaking the social graph based on the discovery queries. And
Yeah,
I
certainly.
personally think that it's more important to protect the social graph than the binding between the CPI and the MSP, if that's the trade-off we have to make.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, if that's a trade-off we have to make where I don't know who I'm talking to versus somebody's gathering a social graph, that's a harder choice for me to make. But Ecker?
Yeah, so I think that I mean, DKG is right that we should avoid leaking stuff here that, that we don't have to in merely because we're worried that the messaging system will not provide the thing we want. Because I think it precludes us to upgrade the messaging system later. I fear we've got to get into a tactical area here. So as people probably know, PR has like sort of limited bandwidth kind of like story in terms of like how big a blob you can generate, and we also have to worry about key material. And so say hypothetically speaking that we wanted to have the mapping stored, the mapping from from user provider provider list stored in the database, and you want to retrieve that with PIR, right? It might or might be possible to have a situation where you actually are also retrieving all the key material with PIR, or it might or might be too expensive. And so I'm not a PR expert. I see Giles is in line, so he may say it's not a problem. But I guess what I was trying to allude to earlier is I think it's very, very important to have the lookup mapping. If I'm looking up, your identity and there are 20 and you're on 20 MSPs, that all 20 should not learn that pair. But when I actually decide to contact you on iMessage, I'm less worried about iMessage learning that pair. So one might imagine, and as Tim says, the PIR versus IP proxying story is not exactly the same security privacy properties. It's maybe the point that there's practicalities we have to fight with, and I think if we're going back to priority of like requirements, the highest priority for me is that uninvolved MSPs do not get to learn the query, because those are the people that are not going to get the information leaked by any other mechanism.
Giles?
On the point that DKG made about protect the conflict between protecting the mapping and protecting the social graph, the normal way to do this is to combine IP binding with anonymous credentials so that you get the ability to protect against large-scale scraping. And there are ways of resolving that conflict. Also on the PIR point, I think we have proven that the retrieving all the key material is tractable. The problem that is another problem that you have to solve with PIR is you want temporary key material to be only usable once for forward secrecy purposes, and to know what key material you have to delete. You can't know what key material you have to delete and not serve again if you're using PIR, and so that's a problem that we have to solve. One way of doing that is whenever the recipient gets a message, they can trigger a clear text deletion query, but that's something that we have to solve as well.
Well, and the good news is we don't need to solve this for the requirements. I think we just need to, again, we're trying to get the higher level direction here of what are we going to go forward with. And I mean, so far I've heard I don't believe I've heard any particular objection to the disjunction here of we want to require one of these two things to happen. And this will be, if we put that forward to people, does anybody here object or think that is incomplete or, I mean, obviously, since we're only talking about the discovery part, it is necessarily incomplete in the sense other parts of this belong to other layers of the architecture. But for the purposes of discovery, does this requirement seem good? We're either going to do the IP blinding or we're going to do the PIR. Yes, Ecker.
I mean, I guess I just don't think we should include the technical piece in this discussion, because maybe someone comes out saying quite clever that we haven't thought about. I think you're right that these are probably the two options, but like, you know, I guess I just don't want to fight it if like
even more.
Yeah. That's all I suggest. But I think there are in fact the two options. But it's just, you know, maybe some cryptographer will come up with something really cool.
So we're either hiding the identifiers of the querier from the MSP/DP, or we're hiding the data the MSP is requesting from the DP. That doesn't prescribe anything about a particular technical
Sounds good to me.
Okay, we're good with that. We can actually put that forward as a requirement for Vancouver, and people will be good. Fantastic. All right, next slide. We're to the end now of the stuff that I had for Brisbane. we're down to it. And this gets back, I think, to a lot of the fundamentals we've been discussing about how it is we imagine authenticated mappings are going to be formulated, what the relationship is to the identities that are actually used, like at an application layer in MIME. And I was certainly looking at the draft May MIME identity when I made these slides for Brisbane, mind you. I understand that we have a moving state of play here. But when we look at this question of who should be able to claim a CPI as an identifier in communications, that I guess is where I'm coming from when I look at this, because I feel like, this is deeply coupled to the discovery question. If I discover some CPI resides at some MSP, I expect that when I have communications with that MSP, regardless of whether there's some tunneling like DKG was alluding to, that would even keep from MSPs who necessarily the participants are in some cases. Like I, at least as an end user, in terms of the end user experience of the system, will have some like identity assurance of who it is that I'm communicating with. Seems to be pretty significant. And I feel like if we've decoupled the way that identity is going to be represented at that application layer, which needs to be interoperable between MSPs, and thus is, I think, in MIME's scope, right, from discovery of these CPIs, then I think we have a problem. That's the basic premise here of the first two bullets. Do people agree that's a problem if those are decoupled? Do people want to go to bat for, do people get that and want to go to bat for some like alternative way of scoping this? And yes, there are pseudonyms and things like that involved as well, and I don't mean to discount those here. So people agree that it would be great if the CPIs that are being discovered have at least some complementary relationship to the CPIs they're using in communications, where people do assert CPIs as opposed to asserting an PSI, as our Newspeak teaches us. Okay. I mean, given that, then my big question is, who do we trust to make these authenticated mappings and why? And what parties need to be involved, and what is it really that these mappings tell us? We've been talking about these mappings for some time in this context of, they're a binding between a CPI and a particular MSP. And Rowan, you can come in just a sec. Let me just finish saying this and then please come in. Great. Who's responsible for that? Who needs to consent to that? Who needs to be involved in order for this CPI is routable at this MSP to be a mapping that gets published to a DP? Rowan, please. Didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to jokingly say, well, you personally, of course.
I object. Yes. Yeah. So I mean, there's a sense in which, as I looked at this problem, and this is again more kind of back when Jonathan was involved in this level of thinking, we started sketching out a way to, try to get the user to be involved, get the MSP to be involved, and get some kind of like certification authority or third party that could be trusted by MSPs that necessarily probably would not be an MSP, to be able to cobble together a binding. And I put out this draft, which again is just kind of reflecting things that me and Jonathan and Femi and Giles were talking about months ago, as an example of a case where you can imagine a kind of three-way handshake process where, when an MSP is enrolling a new user, you effectively the MSP would connect up with an authentication service, an ID prover, that would then be responsible for, sending a code to an end user that the MSP does not know. And the MSP's job is merely to take that code and relay it back to the authentication service provider in order to establish a trust relationship that works, where basically the user has consented to this, particular CPI being associated with this MSP. The MSP has shown that it is indeed its user, or the person it is talking to over the internet, that has, for the case of telephone numbers, that was able to receive an SMS in the telephone number example and gets the 6-digit code and kind of puts it forward. It's I think a bigger question if there's additional metadata like key information, as DKG was alluding to earlier, that also needs to be bound up in this. But ultimately, the idea here is that all of those parties would then kind of give this information to a certification authority who would wrap around that a credential that binds together all of this information. And I raise this only as a straw man to get at what the requirement is here, right? We're getting at, is there a requirement for, the user to participate in the process by which these bindings, these authenticated mappings are established? Is it also a requirement the MSP be involved, since it is indeed the MSP who is the target of the authenticated mapping? The mapping is from a CPI to an MSP. And do we need then, in addition to those two parties, some kind of third party that is actually going to do the proving part, and that could be relied upon by any MSPs, like in subsequent communications, who are consumers these mappings, or end users who are consumers these mappings after talking to a TP? Ecker, enlighten us. This is a straw man.
There's a lot there. Maybe let's try to unwind, just take a couple steps back and ask what as I would say, the physics of the situation, right? If your CPI is a is a routable identifier of some form, right? Via some other, so many of the CPIs in question here are routable identifiers via some other messaging system, which is to say SMS or email, right?
Email, right.
And in those mechanisms, I think the user is inherently involved because the messaging, that the client is not in a position necessarily to intercept those messages, and we don't want it to be, right? I certainly don't want it to be the case that in order to use ekrrtfm.com at WhatsApp, that I have to let WhatsApp read my emails, right? And I understand that there are some mechanisms that people have started trying to build APIs around the SMS that allow partial access to SMS, but it's not amazing stuff.
Spin. Yes.
I know there's been local operating system APIs too.
Yeah.
So I think as a practical matter, I think the user has to be involved in that part of the equation. I think there's DKG kind of hand waved a little bit, and I actually want to sort of engage that for a second, of the notion effectively of a sort of unique user identifier here. What I mean by that is, if you just imagine that we didn't have any infrastructure at all, right? You might imagine an architecture look like this, where the user goes and in some totally disconnected from any messaging form, acquires a credential that proves that they own a specific identifier, right? They have effectively an S- certificate for ekrrtfm.com, and then they use the certificate to assign any number when they subscribe, when they sign on WhatsApp. WhatsApp says, "Would you please sign this assertion that says WhatsApp is able to represent you," and you sign it, right? And in that case, you'd have exactly one key, and this I think corresponds in some very vague way to the MLS key DKG was talking about a few minutes ago. I actually not sure I buy this theory, but I think that it is important to understand the cardinality, how many cryptographic credentials are going to be tied to the user, because one version of this is there's one, and one version of this is there's one for every MSP the user is associated with, right? And I think the natural way to implement this is actually, given the current environment, is actually the second, but that really cuts into our sort of technical theory on the first, right? Namely, what I mean that is where. If I had some key that I used to sign both my WhatsApp assertion and my wire assertion, where's that key stored? and who owns
Yeah,
it
yeah.
and whatever, right?
Yeah.
So DKG, I guess I'd love to. Yeah, I'm good. I was about to summon you to the microphone. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on like how and when actually build a system like this. Even though I actually think I agree with you that like that's actually why they have a best conceptual design. But like, but I'm not sure how to actually build it.
So I didn't mean to imply that there was one, super DKG key that signs DKG at fifthhorseman.net and DKG at ACLU.org. I'm perfectly happy with those two identities being separate identities. And if ACLU is running its own MSP and I'm running my own, MSP out of my basement, I don't have a basement for those following along at home, but if I did, those don't need to be sort of signed by the same key. But the MLS key, for each of them would have a separate MLS key. And my claim is that if I'm trying to map a CPI to those separate MIME identities, that each MIME identity ought to play a role in agreeing that, yes, this mapping is present. Now, of course, anybody can say, hey, if you want to reach phone number 555-1212, you can find them at this particular MIME address, MSP's address. But I'm arguing that if the end user's identifier has keying material associated with it, that keying material should be involved in agreeing to the mapping between the CPI and, of course, that is, clients in general should not accept such a mapping unless the keying material at least self-agrees that mapping is present. Because that creates reverse pressure on the folks who would otherwise publish these mappings and says it's not worth your while to publish an arbitrary mapping unless the user has actually agreed to that mapping.
So I guess I don't think I understand. I do agree that they should countersign them for a technical reason, which is to say to prevent identity misbinding or unknown key share attacks.
Yes.
But I don't think it actually provides. I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure it provides the property that you seem to be implying it provides, which is that I can't just publish bogus bindings because nothing stops. Because I
can publish a table on any web page that says this address is bound to this other address. There's no cryptographic assertions involved at all. We cannot, as you said, the physics of the situation is anybody can assert any binding that they want. And I'm saying if we build the protocol such that there is a requirement that the bound MIME identifier agrees to it before it gets used in the MIME protocol, then it reduces the utility of those external assertions.
But I think that's the part I'm a little confused by. So let me try to concretize this. Let's say that the CPI are RE164 numbers, right? And so you have 555-1212 at at ACO.org and at fifthhorseman.org, right? And those each have some MIME key, some MLS key associated with them, right? Forcing those MLS keys to countersign 555-1212 has the property that it prevents identity misbinding attacks, but it's not the property that it prevents attacker.com from simply asserting that binding because that guy's got all his own MLS keys and he's whatever he wants, right?
That's
okay,
right.
Good. Okay,
I agree with that.
I think on the same page.
That's what this three-way handshake here that I was sketching is supposed to help with, right? and I mean, really, the requirement is however we technically implement it. And I'm not suggesting the version in MIME ID Prover is like the baked and final version of this, but like is that a requirement that we're gonna figure out a way to get a security instrument out of this that is going to both have the MSP that the CPI is pointing to, this element of user consent and involvement in that happening, which, I think from a user experience perspective needs to be dead simple for this to have any possibility of working. So that does make me immediately skeptical of anything where I imagine, end users on their endpoints are going to have to manipulate keys. There are going to be people who are going to be able to do it, but I hesitate to require that, right, in order for this to work. And I'm totally open to like all kinds of things also being bound up in that security instrument, including MLS keys that would, are associated with these particular MSPs or the user service at the MSP, I should say. So, sorry.
I I'm not sure I understand why the user consent would be part of the protocol.
It's part of the security instrument, and the security instrument itself is integral to the protocol. Because the whole purpose, if we're putting out these authenticated mappings, this is really a fundamental question of what needs to be in the mapping and what does the mapping prove. If the mapping does not prove that the user actively consented to and actually owns, right, the telephone number that the mapping represents, then we're at a weird place.
Well,
now we do acknowledge, and let me caveat that, we all acknowledge there are going to be gatekeepers, right, who are going to want to be able to publish authenticated mappings for a ton of legacy users based on something probably no more substantive than somebody clicking okay when the new EULA goes by, right? But an actual security with teeth for this would have a security instrument that is going to be created from this that binds all those properties together in a way that is provable to relying parties, that as a party, as a consumer then of these authenticated mappings who is trying to discover you, when I see, okay, I'm trying to call 5551212, I want to have a reasonable assurance that this is right.
But I don't see how a user entering an OTP gives you any more assurance of that than I mean, on Android we have the SMS retriever API where you can automatically pull an OTP out and insert it into a response.
Because that security association and proof is purely between your MSP and your end user device. The purpose of having a third party be involved in this is that the MSP does not know the shared secret that the third party gives to the user. The user then gives that to the MSP, and when the MSP proxies that through to the third party then has the independent vantage that demonstrates the SMS I sent got to the user, and the user relayed that to the MSP, and it got to me through that. Therefore, it proves that binding, right?
No, I get why the third party has to be involved, but I still don't get why the user has to be actively entering that OTP.
Well, I mean, nobody actually enters these anymore. You just get this thing where you click the button when it shows up. But it's not so much the consent dimension as the proof that of forward routability in the PSTN to the user. You kind of get consent as a side effect, because of course the consumer doesn't consent. They don't click the button that makes that 6-digit code go through, right? And so you can't get random people enrolled by sending random SMSs. This would be part of an interface, an enrollment interface, or some interface that the user has with the MSP at the time, in the context of which that SMS is invoked. The same way we see OTPs for every TFA system in the world today.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I just want to prove that telephone number, actually whoever is behind the device of that is in fact the person who is telling the MSP, this is my telephone number. And you need to have, I think, to get a convincing version of that, a third party involved. But Alyssa is going to say that I'm wrong. So please, Alyssa.
No, I'm just going to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Will the user provide the consent on a per MSP basis or on a per CA basis?
It's a good question. I think it has to be on a per MSP basis, precisely because the CPIs, the mapping itself is from a CPI to an MSP, right? I mean, it's not just a mapping of the CPI to me, the user. It's a mapping of the CPI to an MSP.
Okay, that makes sense.
Wow, getting a real queue here now. Travis.
I guess, a two-part question. Just to clarify the third-party sort of structure here, we have the user, the MSP, and then an undefined third party. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I call it an ID prover. I did a little sketch draft of this. It's not like I, think this is the end all be all. And this is really just trying to capture discussions that were had offline between a few parties about this. But yeah, ID prover, we'll call that guy.
Okay. I don't have necessarily an answer for it, but I would question how much trust we are basically just delegating to that ID prover. Instead of just having the two parties involved where we don't trust either of them necessarily, we are now just saying, okay, well, we definitely trust this third party. but how would we prove that? How would we verify and authenticate that trust in both the third party and the other two parties that are involved?
Well, I mean, in this conversation, I've continually, raised the analogy. It's like a certification authority. And so, I mean, the trust would be, because this entity does one thing. It receives requests from MSPs to prove a particular TN. It sends SMSs, and then it collects from MSPs the 6 digits that they gave them on the basis of which it issues these certificates. It is like effectively an automated function. Like, should we trust Acme? Right? Like, I don't, you could always say Acme services that, issue certificates. Why do we trust them? You trust them because there's a service propped up that does this. And if, your Acme service is bad, then you have a real problem. I agree. But like, I personally, I guess, don't see that as a serious like bar to introducing something like this to the architecture. And more materially, I don't know any other way to solve this than by adding something like this to the architecture. But DKG.
The analogy for the third-party CA architecture is the right one, and I'm also similarly uncomfortable with that and don't have any other solutions to propose. I just wanted to throw in the additional wrinkle here about cadence and timing and expiry. You don't own your CPI forever. And I have no idea if we have any particular plans for how to think about the durability of these things. I certainly don't want to have to reprove that I control my phone number every 5 minutes. But yeah, I don't know. Just wanted to flag that I don't see anybody tackling that here.
No, so Femi actually wrote to me this morning and was like, we should really have a slide about like operational concerns of this, including how, life cycling of the CPIs and things like this. Totally get it. Not an unfamiliar problem from other things for at least telephone numbers as CPIs I look at for other systems. We know there are hard edges on it. What I will say is that similar to those other systems where things like number portability, change ownership of these things, generally speaking, you've got more leeway than 5 minutes. The database may operate, may upgrade that quickly, but the threat window where somebody can do mischief after a number's been ported, isn't that, is like, I think a different question than how quickly the identifiers themselves can port. We definitely, though, need a whole operational discussion about all this. But there's no way of getting around that, by the way, regardless of whether you want to do ID prover. The same problem is going to come up for anything that's going to use CPIs in any meaningful way. Ecker.
Yeah, so I think I agree with DKG that the right analogy is in fact the CA, much as we may not like it. I think to sort of address Alyssa's point, I think there are, from a technical perspective, I think the property you want is not in fact that the ID prover thinks is interfacing with the ISP, sorry, with the MSP, but rather with the user. And now that may in fact secretly be the MSP, and probably in fact won't be most of the time. But that I think I sort of envision a design which is like something like the one I sketched out earlier, which is like that effectively the user has the key. Though again, in practice, like that's probably all embedded in MSP software on one side or another. So I think that's like, and then so the user is consenting to the creation of a binding between some key material stored somewhere or other and their identity at the ID prover, and that is from the perspective of the ID prover demonstrable the user is involved, modular, assuming you trust the routing system that created the binding, and then at some subsequent point that binding is used to create an assertion about the to create an assertion about the MSP, and that is effectively merely like you're trusting the software on like the user's device, right? Or the MSP, right? So I think you certainly could, if you wanted, have a different design that said like actually all these like are tied to MSPs, and like not clear to me how much more user consent that really involves as a practical matter, since the user's just pushing the button on whatever link they were given. I think that I suppose the difference would be that you couldn't use that key then to sign like for MSP2, which might or may not be a property that you want. But I guess I'm a little uncertain about whether we want to like set it up that the MSP is like definitely part of that authentication, the initial approving transaction. Maybe it is, but I'm like a little skeptical about it. But I think generally like what you have here I think is generally correct, by the way. So just like I think we're
Yeah, I mean, and again, just the main intuition that makes me want the MSP involved is simply that the authenticated mapping, as we defined it back on the first principles slide at the beginning of this, is like a mapping between a CPI and an MSP. And so I can imagine, yes, we create some preliminary instrument that then generates authenticated mappings that relies on that, proof having happened. I'm nervous about the user having the equipment and the wherewithal to be active in that process because of the user experience concerns around all this. But I mean, there's probably an architecture that would allow for both, right? There probably is.
Yeah, and I guess I think that like actually probably from a technical perspective, these are probably very similar, right?
Yes.
I guess I mean there is I guess I would say there's. I said that, but now I'm going to backtrack on it a little bit. I mean, so one version of this you can imagine saying is that the ID prover effectively issues what one might call an attribute certificate, right? Which is basically one that says, I, ID prover, have verified that John Peterson has an account at WhatsApp. And then WhatsApp has one key they use to sign everything they ever generate, right? And and then they basically when they want to publish the John Peterson WhatsApp record, right? If they publish it at all, they basically authenticate. They basically attach like an identity. The identity was effectively the identity certificate that says John Peterson WhatsApp to a to a WhatsApp key, right? Or like there's like a version where these are actually identity certificates where like there's a separate key for every user, at least nominally, whether they're overloaded the keys or not. So I don't know that those are architectural choices, but I think probably for requirements discussion, this is a reasonable way for me.
And so that is what I'm trying to extract here. And we should probably wordsmith this a bit on the list in terms of what we think the exact requirement is. But I'm not hearing a lot of resistance to the notion that these are the parties we want to have involved, right? And in what order and who needs to get involved with who first, maybe things that we don't even need to capture the requirements level. Tim.
So I'm hearing like grudging acknowledgement that you want something like a CA here. And that makes me nervous because I frequently encounter like papers or protocol designs or whatever that will go like, and then somebody will run, this PKI for us and it'll be great. Okay. So what I wonder is what would be like the cardinality of, the request that this CA-like thing has to handle? Because like, one of the only reasons that this kind of thing works at all in the web PKI is that issuance is like extremely infrequent relative to the actual, say, volume of TLS traffic. But if the CAs were involved much more, and in fact, this is what we observed with OCSP, it's insanely difficult to run, and like you're just not going to get anybody to run it. So the focus of my question is, how often is the CA actor involved here?
So we say CA, and CA is the right analogy, but what it's generating is not in response to a CSR. You think about this more like, it would probably be something like a job that it's signing rather than it generating certificates. So what is a mapping? Like when I first thought about a mapping, I was like, okay, a mapping could be like a JSON document that just has like a key value pair in it. That's like, this is the CPI and like, this is the MSP and you're done. Of course, we could extend it and have other things in it. But I'm imagining this function being something that just signs documents like that and relying parties who trust it, like consume those. It is analogous to what a CA does. And indeed, if we put like MLS keys or other metadata in it, you could see it like, okay, well, it's now signing some version of keying material, right? Like it starts to look more like a CA, but I'm not proposing it as literally a certification authority, like, Acme style.
Or fine. But that aside, again, like how often does this ID prover get involved? Is it that like, suppose suppose I'm opting into meeting across like 5 messengers, right? Is it that when I say, yeah, I want to be available to like WhatsApp users, the ID prover gets involved at that time? Or is it say every single time a WhatsApp user wants to like connect to me, the ID prover is in the mix?
It's an enrollment function. Delta, what DKG said about refreshing and expiring, right? This is on enrollment, with WhatsApp, you now have the binding from your CPI to WhatsApp. It's this document. You got it from this guy. It may need to be refreshed. And yes, there are operational concerns that's around that we need to get into. But I don't think you get around those at all in any model of this if you have CPIs involved, because there will always be those expiry issues that are associated with CPIs.
I buy that. I guess, yeah, just, we have to be mindful of like the cardinality of requests, but the volume of requests that we're asking some like unnamed benevolent entity to handle here, because I think this can very quickly become an extremely expensive problem to solve.
I got it. And like I said, I think we all recognize the reality that the large gatekeeper legacy providers are unlikely to perform this enrollment function again with like every single one of their users, right? It may be, because of the opt-in-ish qualities of the DMA, it may be just those users who select, I want to be discoverable through this function that they run this for, or even, maybe not even for them. Maybe they'll just make the bald assertion and you just got to suck it up. They are acting as their own ID prover in the same way we talk about MSPs acting as their own DP. Is certainly, I think, a realistic way that could end up being implemented, where you don't really know what they did to do it. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were providers who had, the 800-pound gorilla status to be able to pull that off. But Jonathan.
Yeah, on the revalidation thing, I'm going to raise a hard problem, which is one I've run into in real life, which is why I'm raising it, which is the case where I'm signed up with 5 MSPs, and then I get a new phone, put my SIM in the new phone, and say, well, I never used that client. I'm not going to install it on the new phone. And that provider still has my CPI listed. So if somebody happens to try to contact me on that CPI, the messages get black-holed. And this is something that's happened in real life, which is that Signal has a feature where if you're a Signal subscriber, it'll send you over Signal. Otherwise, it'll send you over SMS. And a friend of mine didn't install Signal on their new phone, and their friend who was using Signal, their messages never reached her. So, I don't know how to solve that other than requiring people to revalidate every 6 hours, which is obviously terrible. So
I don't think it's every 6 hours, but I think
whatever the lifetime you want for people not to be reachable after they get a new phone.
Well, and I'd also remark, there are facts about the way Signal chose to architect that are particularly unfriendly to this approach, right?
Yeah,
so
sure, but,
I can imagine much more sensible things to do than what it
sure,
sounds like.
Yeah, but as far as that provider knows, all it knows is that, hey, your old phone hasn't been turned on. It has no way of knowing about your new phone at all. So it might just think, you're off in the woods for 6 months, and you want all your messages when you come back. So
I would think, actually, as a Signal user, I'd probably want exactly that behavior, or at least given what I understand Signal's premise is. But maybe.
But you see it in the general. The analogy for this case of how do I passively stop using an MSP and have it be correctly deleted? Because you can't.
There are serious operational requirements we would need to investigate in all this. But all right, Giles.
Yeah, on that topic, there's also phone number recycling and reuse, which is also something that we need to address.
Yep. No, I think it's the same issue, actually. Again, whether we consider this to be porting, whether we consider this to be burner numbers that are cycled through, that OTT providers use, that people may only control for an hour or so. It's very popular with robocallers these days, and I'm sure it would be very popular with anyone who's trying to introduce spam into the system as well. And we know a bit about how to combat that just from what we've studied in Stir-Shaken and things like that, but it's not perfect. But that is something, again, that I don't think we get around that by not doing this 3-way mapping, right? I think if we have CPIs in the system, we have to address this problem no matter what. I just think this 3-party system is the least worst of the ways that I can think of anyway.
No, I'm just raising yet another problem that we have to solve.
Yeah. This is just the cost of doing business with CPIs like TNs, which, as I can tell you, having spent my career doing it, is enormous. And you can spend your entire career doing it. Okay, well, that's good. I think at least I got what I wanted from that discussion. And we have 9 minutes left. I think I'd like to use those 9 minutes. Let's just go to the next slide and skip it, I think. Yeah, let's skip this because we actually went through all this, which is good. And just get to path forward. I mean, so we've now gotten through the Brisbane slides. Oh my God, what an accomplishment. I hope we don't need to block out chunks of time like this in the future. I know that Tim and Alyssa have scheduled plenty of future interims. I'm not sure we're gonna need it immediately. I think the plan now is that myself and Giles and Femi are gonna take, and we've been kind of building a little shadow document in the background here, anticipating what the next version of requirements might look like for this. We'd like to get that in shape for Vancouver. If we're incredibly motivated and it turns out we have like a ton of time in the next couple of weeks, maybe we could get even a preliminary version of it out beforehand and have some interim time just to discuss that. I don't know if I feel like I have necessarily that time, but maybe that time does exist. But that I think is the path forward from here. And I mean, if anybody would like to raise any further open issues that we haven't raised, or would like to suggest a different path forward on any of this, or has fantastic ideas, we can discuss them now or on the list. But I'm just glad we got through these slides. Nothing else? I mean, if not, we could even be done. If nobody has anything else to say, we could get 8 minutes of our life back. Yes, Tim.
No, as you say, it sounds like either everyone agrees with your path forward or doesn't want to challenge you on it, which is just as good in IETF terms. So yeah, it's right. So I was going to conclude the meeting on that note, and the only other thing I was going to add is there are more interims scheduled. Certainly, we have one set for 2 weeks from now. I'm going to get the details wrong if I try to say it, so just go check the data tracker. We'll be back on MIMI protocol stuff. I don't think there's anything explicit on the agenda yet, so the plan of record would be to just do to scrub through issues and PRs on those documents. As ever, if there's something that anybody would like to discuss at the next interim, please let us know. Rowan?
Yeah, I asked a few people for some help on a privacy threat model for the MIMI protocol. So to the extent that we have some of those things ready, then we may be able to discuss that. And then, of course, there is there's what Brendan brought up at the last interim, and I'm kind of trying to restart some discussions about a couple of the things here, particularly external commits and what the requirements are around that. But it'd be very useful if we could get a couple of people who anybody who's actually implementing to chime in about to what extent the use of external commits is important for them, because that is I think that has a big impact on the trade-offs that we make in this case.
Okay, thanks for that call to action. And the remaining thing is that we have a consensus call on wire encoding format for MIMI content that is ending today, end of business, which is kind of vague depending on time zone. So if you have an opinion about TLS presentation language versus CBOR, please reply on list to the thread that was started a couple weeks ago. And the chairs will be wrapping that up probably in the next 24 hours. Okay, I think that's everything for today. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you in another 2 weeks. So long.